Content warning. This audiobook contains strong language, sexual themes, supernatural elements, and graphic depictions of death. The author recommends this work for audiences aged 18 and over. If you let your 6-year-old listen, that's on you. Dark Matter, The Order of the Hidden Cross, by Ian Bailey, published by Ashlar Press. Copyright 2025. Chapter 14, The Erased. Paolo sat in his cold stone chamber, the flame of his oil lamp flickering weakly against the oppressive darkness. His hand trembled as it gripped a quill, hovering above the parchment. The air was thick with must and the scent of ink, but beneath that, a deeper, darker presence loomed, something Paolo couldn't shake since the moment he laid eyes on him. The order demanded silence. Every guard was sworn to an oath from the moment they were tapped on the shoulder, a weight Paolo had carried without question until the whispers began. Until tonight, his eyes drifted to the door, still shut, still locked, but offering little reassurance. The events of the night replayed in his mind, over and over, like a haunting refrain. The chamber below the monastery, the forbidden place far beneath the Vatican, where he had been sent on a simple errand, a task meant to be quick and uneventful, but instead he had seen him, Yehoshua. No, not the Yehoshua he had learned of in Scripture, not the glorious ascended figure that had risen to the right hand of God. This was something far more terrible, something more grotesque. This was a man, barely a man, dangling between life and death, held in a perpetual state of suffering by powers Paolo could barely comprehend. Yehoshua's body had been mutilated by time, decayed but unyielding to death. His skin hung like thin parchment over brittle bones, pocked with ancient festering wounds. They had never healed. They couldn't. His eyes, sunken, hollow, had twitched as Paolo entered the chamber, his lids fluttering as if trying to open. There had been no divine light in those eyes, only suffering. Paolo heard the faintest sound from Yehoshua's lips, like a groan, like a man trying to speak after centuries of silence. It was a sound that would haunt Paolo for the rest of his short life. "Paolo," came the weak, rasping voice. Paolo's breath caught in his throat, and he stepped closer, almost against his will. His heart pounded in his chest as the broken figure on the stone slab struggled to raise his head. Then, with the effort of a man pushing through an eternity of pain, the man whispered, "I am Yehoshua." The words were barely audible, as though they had taken every ounce of strength the ancient figure had left. His body trembled slightly, as if even speaking those words had drained what little life remained in him. Paolo's blood turned cold. This was Yehoshua, the Yehoshua. His mind screamed in protest, refusing to accept the truth that lay before him. Everything he had been taught, everything he had believed, it was all unraveling in this single, horrifying moment. He knew there was a truth to these words, he just knew it. He stumbled backwards, nearly tripping over his feet as he tried to comprehend what he had just heard. This was not supposed to be possible. Yehoshua had ascended, he had risen. Yet, here he was, broken and barely alive, in a hidden chamber beneath the monastery. Could this broken, suffering creature truly be the Messiah? Paolo's mind reeled at the thought. His years of prayer and devotion seemed to mock him now, a cruel echo against the grotesque reality before him. And now that truth, or whatever it was, lay festering in a hidden chamber beneath the monastery, forgotten and broken. Panic gripped Paolo, tightening around his chest like a vice. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't bear to be in the presence of this thing that should not be. His legs moved before his mind could catch up, and he fled the room, locking it in behind him, his footsteps echoing wildly in the narrow corridors as he raced back to his chamber. Slamming the door shut behind him, Paolo collapsed against the cold stone wall, his heart thundering in his ears. He gasped for breath, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The truth clawed at him, ripping apart everything he thought he knew. Yehoshua had not ascended, had not risen. He had been kept prisoner, trapped in a state between life and death, hidden away from the world. Paolo's head spun as he fought to process the weight of the revelation. The Order of the Hidden Cross, the very sect he had devoted his life to, was built on a lie, a horrible, insidious lie. The Messiah was not the glorified figure the Church proclaimed. He was a prisoner, broken and reduced to nothing more than a frail shell of his former self. Paolo's breaths came in ragged gasps as he tried to steady himself. He couldn't let this stay hidden. He had to document what he had seen, what he now knew to be true. But his hands shook so violently that it took several tries to light the small oil lamp on his desk. He grabbed a scrap of parchment and dipped his quill into the ink, his heart still racing as his thoughts tumbled out in a frenzied scrawl. I have seen him. I have seen Yehoshua, alive but barely, hidden in a chamber below the monastery. He is not dead. He has not risen. The Order has lied. Everything is a lie. His hand shook, smearing the ink. Paolo paused, his breath shallow and uneven. The enormity of what he was writing felt like a weight on his chest, crushing him with each stroke of the quill. He couldn't believe what he was doing. If anyone found out, if the Order learned of his treachery, he would be silenced, erased, just like the others. But the world had to know. As he wrote, the temperature in the room began to drop. At first, he thought it was his nerves, the adrenaline finally leaving his body. But then the air grew colder. A thick, oppressive cold that pressed down on him like the weight of 1,000 winters. His breath misted in the lamplight, and the shadows around him deepened, growing darker and more tangible. Paolo froze, his quill still hovering above the parchment. Something was here. The temperature dropped suddenly, the chill biting into Paolo's skin. The shadows seemed to twist, curling at the edges, and then the scratching started, slow at first, like something sharp against stone. Paolo's heart skipped a beat as the sound grew closer and louder. He turned his head, his eyes locking on the corner of the room where the demon began to materialize. The shadows on the walls twisted and contorted, and from the corner of the chamber, a shape began to emerge. It was darker than the night itself, a figure that seemed to swallow the light around it. And then he saw it. Paolo stared at the demon, heart pounding in his chest, eyes wide in terror. The room had grown impossibly cold, and every shadow seemed alive, pulsing with some ancient malevolence that made the very air feel toxic. He couldn't move. His legs were like stone, rooted to the spot by the horror of what stood before him. The demon was a thing of nightmares, its hulking form twisted between flesh and shadow, its skin slick and oily, like the darkest part of a forgotten abyss. Its eyes glowed a deep, violent red, flickering with an unnatural hunger. It wasn't just a physical presence. It was something deeper, something far more ancient than anything Paolo had ever imagined. The creature seemed to radiate darkness itself, a force of primordial evil that devoured everything around it, leaving only the cold, empty air of despair in its wake. "You know too much," the demon hissed, its voice slithering through the air like smoke. "Now, you must be taken." Paolo's breath caught in his throat as the demon raised one clawed hand, fingers longer than his forearm and ending in wickedly sharp points. His legs screamed to run, but they refused to move. His heart hammered against his ribs as if it could escape the fate his body was already succumbing to. He opened his mouth to scream, to plead, but his voice was stolen by the crushing terror that held him in place. The demon stepped closer, its claws dripping with shadows that slithered along the stone floor. Paolo felt a wave of nausea as the creature reached toward him, its sharp black talons hovering over his chest. For a brief moment there was a pause, as though time itself had frozen. Then, with a swift, sickening motion, the demon drove one claw into Paolo's chest. A wave of pain, sharper than anything Paolo had ever known, exploded through his body. His breath caught in a strangled gasp as the claw pierced his flesh, the sound of tearing skin and muscle filling the chamber. The demon's talon moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring every moment. Paolo's vision blurred as tears welled up in his eyes, the sheer agony forcing him to his knees. And then it began. The claw wasn't just tearing his body, it was opening something inside him, ripping a hole not just in his flesh, but in the very fabric of his existence. It was as if the demon's claw was a key, unlocking some hidden, cursed part of him that had always been waiting to be torn open. Paolo felt a pull like an unseen hand was reaching into him, grabbing hold of something deep within his chest and yanking it out. The demon grinned, a grotesque mockery of satisfaction, as the tear in Paolo's chest grew wider. Not just blood, but something darker began to seep out, an inky blackness, as though his very soul was leaking from the wound. The world around him began to warp, twisting and spinning, as if reality itself was breaking apart. Paolo tried to scream, but no sound came out. His body was no longer his own. It was being devoured by the rift that the demon had carved into him. Slowly, impossibly, he felt himself being pulled into the tear, into the dark opening in his chest. His body jerked violently as it was dragged toward the wound, inch by inch, like a puppet with its strings pulled by some cruel, unseen hand. He could feel his bones cracking, splintering under the force of whatever lay beyond that tear. His skin stretched and tore, his muscles ripping apart as he was drawn into the abyss. He felt his ribs snap one by one, the pain so intense that he nearly blacked out, but some malevolent force kept him conscious, forced him to experience every moment of his body being torn apart. His legs, his arms, everything was being pulled into that gaping wound, being absorbed into the darkness. He looked down in horror to see his limbs twisting, folding unnaturally into the black void that the demon had opened within him. It was as though he were collapsing into himself, his body contorting and breaking as it was sucked into the endless dark. The pain was unbearable, beyond anything a human should have been able to endure. Every nerve in his body was on fire, his skin ripping apart as the darkness consumed him. His bones splintered like dry wood, his muscles tore with wet, sickening snaps, and his very essence was dragged toward the abyss, piece by agonizing piece. As his body broke apart, Paolo's mind began to splinter as well. His thoughts unraveled, scattered in the howling void. He could feel his memories, his identity, everything that made him, being ripped away, slipping into the infinite darkness. His whole life, the monastery, the faces of those he cared for and loved, they all flickered and vanished, consumed by the void, leaving only cold, empty silence. Paolo's consciousness began to slip, fragments of himself breaking away as the void consumed him. But even as his body and soul were being torn apart, he felt something else. The darkness was not empty. It was alive. It was waiting for him. He felt it, in the endless black. Something ancient, something watching. And then, suddenly, he was falling. His stomach lurched as the ground disappeared beneath him, and he plunged into the abyss. The darkness rushed up to meet him, swallowing him whole, enveloping him in a cold, suffocating embrace. His limbs flailed uselessly as he tumbled through the void, his screams swallowed by the oppressive silence that surrounded him. There was no up or down, no direction to orient himself. He was weightless, suspended in the black nothingness that stretched infinitely in all directions. The only sound was the pounding of his heartbeat, deafening in the silence. And then it began. The first tendrils of dark matter reached out to him, slithering over his skin like serpents, cold and unyielding. They coiled around his limbs, tightening their grip, squeezing the life out of him. He struggled, but it was futile. The tendrils were not physical. There was nothing to grab, nothing to fight against. They seeped into his skin, penetrating deeper, wrapping around his bones, his organs, his mind. He had no time to comprehend the full horror of it before he was pulled further into the void, his body and soul disintegrating into the blackness. Paolo was no more. In the chamber, the demon stood over the blood-stained stone floor, its eyes flickering with faint, malicious satisfaction. The job was done. The demon retreated back into the shadows, but it wasn't alone. A mist stirred in the corner of the room, a figure barely discernible in the dim light of the flickering oil lamps. The memory keeper stepped forward, its pale, featureless face reflecting nothing but cold detachment. It moved with an eerie grace, its presence almost imperceptible yet undeniably powerful. It approached the desk where Paolo had begun to write his account. The memory keeper gently lifted the parchment from the desk, the report Paolo had been so desperate to complete. It examined the words for a moment, then its hand hovered over the parchment, its translucent fingers tracing the words scrawled in a frantic, desperate hand. The ink on the page began to bleed, the letters dissolving into nothingness, as though they had never existed. As the last word faded from the parchment, the room fell silent, the faint scent of blood still lingering in the air. The Order's secrets remained safe. Paolo was erased, not just from the monastery, but from history itself. No memory of him would survive, no echo of his name would be whispered. It was as if he had never been born. Yet the memory keeper did not leave. Its form, spectral and thin, glided across the room toward the wall, pausing at a blank section of stone. With one slender, almost translucent finger, it began to carve a symbol into the wall, its touch leaving faint glowing lines in its wake. The lines twisted and curved, forming a shape that defied logic, a symbol that seemed to pulse with its own life, as if it existed in dimensions beyond human comprehension. The symbol flickered faintly before dimming, its presence etched not just into stone but into the very fabric of the room. It was not a mere mark. It was a seal, binding the room and the Order's secrets in eternal silence. The memory keeper took one last glance around the room, ensuring that all evidence had been erased, that Paolo's existence had been entirely scrubbed from reality. Satisfied, it turned toward the door, its movements eerily graceful, and vanished into the shadows from whence it came. But the symbol remained. Though invisible to most, it was there, a twisted, pulsating mark etched into the fabric of the stone. It wasn't just a symbol. It was a warning, a sign that Paolo's fate had been sealed long before he had stepped into that hidden chamber, a sign that others had come before him, and others would follow. As the room fell silent once again, a faint gust of wind stirred the dust, revealing that Paolo's name, once scrawled on the wall by some long-forgotten hand, had also disappeared, replaced by a small, barely discernible inscription etched beneath the symbol. Ego sum ultimus, non primus, non solus. I am the last, not the first, not the only one. The stone walls had seen countless souls vanish within their cold embrace, and this chamber would witness countless more. Paolo was gone, his memory, his body, and his very existence erased. But the cycle was far from over. The next soul had already been chosen. This chapter may have ended, but the story doesn't. Return next Monday for what waits in the dark. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and leave a comment